Weird ways medieval people tested if you were lying. So you've been accused of stealing a pig. Or maybe you looked at the Lord's wife for half a second too long. Or perhaps your neighbor simply doesn't like your face. Whatever the reason, you're now standing in front of a medieval court, and they want the truth. The problem is, they don't have surveillance cameras. They don't have fingerprints. They don't even have a reliable confession method that doesn't involve breaking your bones. What they do have is a spectacularly creative, often terrifying, and deeply bizarre set of rituals designed to separate liars from truth-tellers. And let me tell you right now, you do not want to be the liar. Let's start with the most famous one, because it's also the most insane trial by ordeal. Specifically, the ordeal of hot iron. The idea was simple in theory, brutal in practice. A piece of iron would be heated until it glowed red, sometimes white. The accused would then be required to carry that iron for a set distance, usually 9 feet, sometimes more. Afterward, their hand would be bandaged and left alone for 3 days. On the 3rd day, a priest or a judge would unwrap the wound. If the burn was healing cleanly, no pus, no blackening, no foul smell, you were innocent. If the wound looked infected or festering, you were guilty. That's it. That's the test. Now, you might be thinking, wait, wouldn't anyone's hand get horrifically burned by a red-hot iron? Absolutely yes. The trick, and there was a trick, at least for some, was that the church believed God would intervene to protect the innocent. St. Peter didn't burn when he walked on hot coals, so why would a truthful peasant? In practice, most hands became infected regardless of truth. But the system had a strange internal logic. If you were guilty, God would let your wound fester as a sign. If you were innocent, God would heal you supernaturally. The actual outcome often depended less on divine intervention and more on how much you paid the priest to wrap your hand loosely, or how clean the bandages were. Infection was bacterial, not moral, but medieval people didn't know that. What's even stranger is how common this was. From the 9th to the 13th century, hot iron ordeals were standard procedure across much of Europe. There were rules. The iron had to weigh exactly 1 pound. The distance was measured by a priest's foot. The accused had to pray beforehand, fast, and attend mass. Some versions required you to walk 9 paces barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares. That's right, plowshares. 9 of them, lined up like a deadly hopscotch. Imagine explaining that to your family. So, Dad, how was your day in court? Well, son, I walked on 9 burning plowshares. The good news is my feet are now souvenirs. The bad news is they think I'm innocent because the blisters look clean. Hooray! But hot iron was only the beginning. There was also the ordeal of cold water, and this one will really bake your noodle. Here's how it worked. You were tied up, hands to feet, like a human pretzel. Then you were lowered into a body of water, a river, a pond, a blessed well, sometimes even a barrel of holy water. The idea came from the Bible, sort of. In the book of Exodus, there's a passage about testing a woman accused of adultery by making her drink bitter water. That evolved over centuries into the notion that water, being the element of baptism, would reject the impure. So here's the logic. Pure water is a holy thing. A liar is unclean. Therefore, if you're guilty, the water will accept you, you'll sink. If you're innocent, the water will reject you, you'll float. Yes, you heard that correctly. Sinking means innocent. Floating means guilty. Pause and let that sink in. Or float. Most of us today would think sinking is bad, you drown. But in medieval cold water ordeal, sinking was literally a lifesaver. If you floated, you were pulled out and hanged or burned. If you sank, you were quickly fished out, hopefully before you actually drowned, and declared innocent. The paradox is staggering. The practice assumed that water, as a pure element, would naturally expel a liar, pushing them upward. Meanwhile, the truthful person, being in harmony with creation, would be welcomed downward into the water's embrace. This didn't make any physical sense, obviously, but it made theological sense to medieval minds. And that's the key to understanding all of these tests. They weren't about logic. They were about a worldview where God personally oversaw every single trial and would never allow an innocent person to be harmed. Of course, the practical results were grim. If you were thin, or if the water was cold, or if you involuntarily gasped and took in air, guess what? You floated. Guilty. If you were muscular, heavy-boned, or simply terrified into rigidity, you sank. Innocent. The priest would bless the water first, recite a prayer, and then the dunking would happen. Some records show that accused people were thrown into the water 3 times to be sure. First time, he floats. Second time, he floats. Third time, still floating. Burn him. You couldn't make this up. But let's move to another classic. The ordeal of the Eucharist, often called the corsned, from Old English korsned, meaning test bite. This was the soft option, relatively speaking. No fire, no drowning. Instead, you were given a piece of consecrated bread, the host, the body of Christ, and a piece of cheese, typically made from ewe's milk. You had to eat them both, but only after swearing an oath that you were telling the truth. The belief was that if you were lying, the bread and cheese would choke you. You'd gag, you'd swell, you'd turn blue, and sometimes, according to legend, you'd simply drop dead on the spot. If you swallowed without trouble, you were innocent. This test was especially popular in Anglo-Saxon England, and it persisted for centuries. There's a famous story about a bishop named Edric in the 11th century who was accused of treason. He demanded the corsned. He ate it. He didn't choke. Everyone went home confused and declared him innocent. Historians suspect that the corsned worked because of a powerful placebo effect. The sheer terror of divine retribution could cause real throat spasms. Or maybe the cheese was just really dry. Either way, compared to hot iron, the corsned was a blessing. You got a snack. And if you were innocent, you got a snack in your life. Now, what if you were a noble? Commoners got water and fire. Nobles got something far more cinematic. Trial by combat. Is exactly what it sounds like. 2 people, the accuser and the accused, would fight each other to the death, or at least to first blood or submission. The belief was that God would grant victory to the truthful party. Might makes right? Oh no, God makes might. So if you won the fight, you were telling the truth. If you lost and died, well, you were a liar and a sinner, and the outcome was just. Trial by combat wasn't just a duel with swords. There were elaborate rules. You could hire a champion to fight for you, provided you were old, female, a child, or physically disabled. Champions were essentially professional lie detectors with armor. Some cities had official champion guilds. The duel would take place in a judicial ring, often with priests praying on the sidelines. You had to swear on relics that your cause was just. Then you fought. In some versions, if the accused defeated the accuser was executed for bearing false witness. That created a strong disincentive to accuse people randomly. But of course, the better fighter usually won, regardless of guilt. So medieval justice favored the strong and the wealthy, who could hire the strongest champion. One of the strangest variations of trial by combat was the judicial duel between a man and a woman, specifically in cases of alleged rape or serious slander. The rules were wild. The man would stand in a pit up to his waist. The woman would run around the edge of the pit with a weighted stone tied to a cloth. She would try to hit the man's head. He would try to grab her and pull her into the pit. If he pulled her in, he won, meaning he was innocent. If she hit his head hard enough to knock him out or kill him, she won, meaning her accusation was true. This actually happened in Germany and Switzerland. You can see medieval illustrations of it. They look like a bizarre carnival game designed by a very angry monk. But wait, there's more. The ordeal of the cross. This one is extremely strange and almost never used because it required a priest to perform a kind of divine showdown. Two people, the accuser and the accused, would stand on opposite sides of a wooden cross. They would each extend their arms out to the sides, mimicking the crucifixion pose. Then they would just stand there. The first person to lower their arms or move was the liar. That's it. Endurance contest. But here's the twist. The priest would pray that God cause the liar to collapse immediately. Sometimes the priest would also invoke St. Paul's curse. In practice, this ordeal only worked if one of the participants was physically weak or frightened. But some medieval sources claim that the liar would be struck by an invisible force, shaking, sweating, falling down. More likely, after an hour of standing with arms out, everyone's arms hurt, and the weaker person gave up first. Now let's talk about some of the truly weird local variations. In 13th century Bavaria, there was a test involving a pot of boiling water. You had to plunge your hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Your arm was then bandaged and examined 3 days later, similar to the hot iron. But here's the bizarre part. The water was supposed to be blessed, and thus harmless to the innocent. In some records, the stone was a ring or a key, the object of dispute. So you had to find it in boiling water. The stakes: if you were innocent, your hand would come out unscathed. If you were guilty, you'd be scalded. Let's be real, everyone was scalded. But the priest would interpret the scalding. Clean blisters? Innocent. Black, weeping burns? Guilty. Infection again determined everything. There's also the ordeal of the Psalter. A Psalter, a book of Psalms, would be placed on the ground. The accused would stand in front of it. Then a second person, often a child or a virgin, would walk around the accused holding a piece of hot iron or a candle. If the accused flinched, they were guilty. This one is less about divine intervention and more about psychological pressure, the medieval version of a lie detector that measures stress responses. But because it wasn't official church ordeal, it was mostly used by local lords who didn't want to burn their subjects. Let's not forget the ordeal of the grave. This was used in cases of suspected murder. The accused would be brought to the victim's grave. They had to touch the grave, or sometimes the corpse itself. If the corpse bled or moved, the accused was guilty. This belief in cruentation, the idea that a murder victim's body will bleed in the presence of the killer, lasted well into the 17th century. There are recorded cases from medieval Germany where a suspected poisoner was forced to put their hand in the mouth of a corpse. The corpse's jaw had been rigged with a spring by the accuser's family. When the hand went in, the jaw snapped shut. Everyone screamed, "Guilty!" and the suspect was executed. That's not divine justice. That's just a trap. But people believed it. Now, why did people actually believe these tests worked? Partly because they lived in a world where every thunderstorm, every crop failure, every toothache was attributed to supernatural forces. If God could make the sun stand still for Joshua, surely he could keep a hand from burning for an innocent person. Also, the church carefully controlled the ordeals. The priest would pray, "Bless the iron, bless the water," and then the outcome was God's decision. No priest ever admitted that the outcome depended on basic physics. Instead, they said things like, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." If an innocent person's hand got infected, which it always did, the priest would say that the person had secret sins, or that God was testing their faith. There was always a loophole. But here's the real kicker. These ordeals actually worked as lie detection in a roundabout sociological way. Think about it. If you were guilty, and you truly believed that God would burn your hand off in front of everyone, would you volunteer for the ordeal? You would confess. And many did. The ordeal was never intended to be a perfect physical test. It was intended to be a terror-based confession machine. The guilty, terrified of divine punishment, would admit their crime before the hot iron even left the fire. The innocent, or the truly delusional, would go through with it. And since most people were deeply religious, the ordeals had a real deterrent effect. The liar rate among people who agreed to hot iron was probably quite low, not because the iron worked, but because only the innocent were willing to risk it. Of course, that logic fails once you realize that some guilty people are also stupid, or overconfident, or believe God will forgive them anyway. Or they simply have no choice. If your Lord orders you to undergo the ordeal, you can't refuse. Refusal was automatically treated as a confession of guilt. So you went along even if you knew you'd burn. And you burned. Now, let's address the most important question. Did anyone ever actually pass these tests? The course was passed regularly, because no one choked on bread and cheese unless it was deliberately poisoned. The hot iron? Records show that some people did heal cleanly. 3 possibilities. First, if the iron wasn't actually red hot, some priests faked the heat to be merciful. Second, if the wound was treated with herbal salves that prevented infection, some monasteries had excellent medicine. Third, if the accused had calloused hands or very dry skin that formed a quick eschar. There's a documented case from 1120 in Canterbury where a man carried the hot iron 9 feet, his hand blistered but didn't fester, and he was declared innocent. He then became a local hero. People brought him gifts. He changed his name to Iron Hand. Whether he was actually innocent, we'll never know. But the weirdest part of all is how these tests died out. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, a major church meeting, forbade priests from participating in ordeals. But not because the church suddenly realized that hot iron burns everyone. The official reason was that the ordeal was a temptation of God. Demanding a miracle was presumptuous. The church wanted to move toward a more rational system. Witness testimony, written evidence, and canon law. Trial by ordeal was replaced by trial by jury in many places. But old habits die hard. In some remote villages of Germany and Switzerland, cold water ordeals continued into the 16th century, and not just for lying, but for witchcraft. The famous swimming of witches was a direct descendant of the ordeal of cold water. And in that case, floating meant guilty, so witches were condemned for floating, which is exactly the same principle. So the weirdness never really ended. It just changed outfits. Let me tell you about one last method because it's too strange to skip. The ordeal of the Bible. A Bible would be placed on a table. A key would be inserted between certain pages, usually between Psalms 49 and 50. The key would be wrapped in a cloth. The two parties, the accuser and the accused, would each hold the cloth. Then a priest would pray. The first person whose thumb slipped off the cloth was the liar. That's it. A test of grip strength and sweat. But people took it deadly seriously. This was used primarily in minor disputes, theft of a chicken, boundary disagreements, not capital crimes. Still, imagine losing your farm because your thumb got sweaty. Now, you might be thinking, didn't medieval people have any common sense? Yes, actually. Many medieval thinkers were deeply skeptical of ordeals. In the 12th century, a scholar named Peter the Chanter wrote that ordeals were irrational because they punished the innocent as often as the guilty. He argued that confession and witnesses were better. But his voice was drowned out by centuries of tradition. Also, ordeals had a political function. Lords could use them to intimidate peasants. The church could use them to demonstrate its power. And when an ordeal worked, meaning the accuser or accused died or confessed, everyone felt satisfied that justice had been done. It was a system that produced closure, not truth. And that brings us to the human side. Imagine being a medieval peasant named Agnes. You're accused of stealing a loaf of bread from the miller's wife. You didn't do it, but the miller's wife is popular. The local bailiff doesn't like you. He orders you to undergo the cold water ordeal. You're tied up. You're lowered into the icy river in November. You float. The crowd gasps. You're guilty. You're pulled out, shivering, and dragged to the gallows. You spend your last night praying to a god who you believed would save you, but didn't. Or maybe you sink. You're pulled out half-drowned, coughing water, and declared innocent. The miller's wife glares at you. But you go home. You live. And you never, ever forget the feeling of cold water closing over your head because someone thought that was a reasonable lie detector. That's the real legacy of medieval lie detection. Not cleverness. Not magic. Brutality wrapped in a robe of faith. And yet, we can't help but be fascinated. Because in their desperation to find the truth, medieval people invented rituals that are simultaneously horrifying and hilarious, cruel and creative. They turned a lie detector into a hot iron, a cold river, a piece of cheese, a bloody duel, a corpse's mouth. They believed that God would sort it out. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were right, purely by accident. But mostly people just got burned. So the next time you're in an argument and someone says, "I swear on my mother's grave," be grateful they don't hand you a red-hot poker. Because that's how we used to do it. And frankly, it's a miracle our ancestors survived long enough to invent things like juries and lawyers and actual forensics. But also, and here's the strange ending, part of you wonders, would it be more honest? If you had to carry hot iron to prove you weren't lying, would you lie as often? Probably not. You might keep your mouth shut. And that, in a twisted way, is a kind of truth. Let's pick up exactly where we left off. You've heard about hot iron, cold water, blessed bread, trial by combat, the cross, the psalter, the grave, the boiling pot, the Bible key. But believe me, that's not even half of it. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, and every single one of them had its own favorite flavor of divine lie detection. Some were gentle, most were not, and a few were so strange that even by medieval standards, people looked at them sideways. So let's go deeper. Let's talk about the ordeal of the rod. This one comes from early medieval Frankish law, specifically the Salian Franks. Here's how it worked. A wooden rod, usually hazel or ash about a foot long, was placed on the ground. Two accused parties, or sometimes an accuser and an accused, would stand on either side of the rod. Then a priest would say a prayer over them, asking God to make the rod move toward the liar. That's it. No one touched the rod. They just stared at it. If the rod rolled or shifted even slightly, the person it pointed toward was declared guilty. Now, you might think this is laughable, a rod that moves by itself? But medieval people believed that God could animate inanimate objects. There are court records from 9th century Burgundy where a rod allegedly rolled 3 feet toward a woman accused of killing her husband's cattle. She was executed. Later historians suspect the priest nudged the rod with his foot or that the floor wasn't level. But at the time, it was considered a valid test. Then there's the ordeal of the fire, not hot iron, but walking through actual flames. This was rarer, reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, arson ironically, and heresy. The accused would have to walk barefoot through a path of burning coals, usually about 9 to 12 feet long. If they emerged without severe burns, they were innocent. If they screamed, fell, or suffered third-degree burns, they were guilty. The most famous recorded case is from 1080 in Constantinople, where a monk accused of conspiring with the Turks walked through a fire pit and came out with only singed robes. The emperor declared him innocent. The monk later admitted on his deathbed that he had greased his feet with a mixture of egg white and plant sap that formed a temporary heat barrier. So it wasn't divine intervention, it was early chemistry. But the crowd didn't know that. They saw a miracle. Let's travel north to Scandinavia, because the Norse had their own beautifully brutal methods. In medieval Iceland and Norway, one common lie test was the ordeal of the hot stone. A stone would be heated in a fire until it was nearly molten. The accused would have to pick it up with their bare hand and carry it 3 steps. Their hand was then wrapped. 3 days later, if the burn was clean, they were innocent. Sound familiar? It's basically the hot iron but with a rock. The Icelandic sagas mention this several times. In Grettis saga, a man accused of theft is forced to pick up a hot stone. His hand blisters horribly, but he refuses to drop it. The priest declares him innocent because of his steadfast faith. He was probably just stubborn, but he lived. But the Norse had another method that's almost never discussed, the ordeal of the cauldron lid. A large iron cauldron would be filled with boiling water. A lid was placed on top. The accused had to place their bare forearm on the lid while a priest poured a small amount of hot water over it. The idea was that the lid would protect the arm from the worst of the heat, but only if you were innocent. If you were guilty, the steam would rise through the lid's seams and scald you. This makes no thermodynamic sense whatsoever. Steam rises regardless of guilt. But again, the test wasn't about physics. It was about the priest's interpretation. A guilty verdict was often prearranged by the local chieftain. The lid would have holes drilled in it. The innocent verdict came from a solid lid. So the real lie detector was the blacksmith who made the lid. Corruption, not God. Now let's go east, to medieval Poland and Bohemia. There we find the ordeal of the bees. This is one of my personal favorites. A beehive would be placed inside a clay pot. The accused would have to put their hand into the pot and retrieve a small iron ring. If the bees stung them, they were guilty. If the bees did not sting them, they were innocent. Now, bees are not aggressive unless provoked. If you move slowly and calmly, most bees will ignore you. But medieval people didn't know that. They believed bees were creatures of purity and order, the medieval symbol of chastity and truth. So a truthful person would emit an honest scent that bees respected. A liar would smell of sin, and the bees would attack. In practice, people who were terrified, and therefore sweating and breathing heavily, were more likely to be stung. So the guilty verdict went to the visibly anxious person. That's not entirely unfair as a lie detector. Anxious people might be lying. Or they might just be terrified of sticking their hand into a pot of bees. Either way, the ordeal of the bees was considered mild because bee stings rarely kill. Unless you're allergic. In which case, God apparently really wanted you dead. Moving further east into Byzantium, we find the ordeal of the Eucharist with a twist. In 11th century Constantinople, accused liars were sometimes given a piece of consecrated bread that had been soaked in sulfuric water. If you were guilty, the priest claimed you would vomit. If you were innocent, you would keep it down. This is one of the earliest examples of a chemically assisted ordeal. Sulfuric water, actually very dilute sulfuric acid from natural springs, causes nausea and vomiting in most people, regardless of guilt. But the dose could be adjusted. If the authorities wanted you to vomit, they increased the concentration. If they wanted you to pass, they used plain holy water. So again, the outcome was controlled by the tester. The Byzantines also had an ordeal involving a censer, a metal container for burning incense. The accused had to hold a red-hot censer chain. If their hand did not blister, they were innocent. The chain was often pre-cooled for favored individuals. Corruption is the oldest lie detector. Now let's talk about the ordeal of the beer, which we touched on briefly but deserves a full treatment. This was used specifically in suspected murder cases where the body had been found but no witness existed. The accused would be brought to the beer, the wooden frame holding the corpse. They would have to place both hands on the chest of the dead person and swear an oath of innocence. Then they would step back. The priest would pray. If the corpse bled from the nose, mouth, or ears, the accused was guilty. This belief, cruentation, persisted for centuries. There's a famous case from 1628 in Germany where a man named Johannes Rebmann was accused of killing his wife. He was forced to touch her corpse. According to court records, immediately blood flowed from the nostrils and mouth. He confessed under torture and was executed. But here's the thing. Corpses can bleed if pressure is applied to the thoracic cavity. Air trapped in the lungs can push out residual blood. It's not magic. But in the medieval mind, it was proof beyond doubt. Some priests even wrote handbooks on how to make a corpse bleed for a fee. A quick squeeze of a hidden bladder filled with animal blood. The family of the victim would pay extra for a positive result. Switzerland had a particularly creative method called the ordeal of the bell. This was used in monastery courts for monks accused of lying about small infractions, stealing wine, breaking a fast, speaking after Compline. A small silver bell would be suspended from a wooden frame. The accused would have to stand beneath it and swear an oath. Then a bell ringer would strike the bell once. If the bell rang true, a clear, sustained tone, the monk was innocent. If the bell made a dull, muffled sound, he was guilty. The bell ringer was often a senior monk who could adjust the striker or dampen the bell with a cloth. So it was entirely rigged. But the other monks didn't know that. They heard the bell and believed. This shows how even the gentle tests were still performances designed to produce a predetermined verdict. Let's not forget the ordeal of the ladder, used in rural England during the 12th century. A wooden ladder would be placed against a wall. The accused had to climb to the top rung, turn around, and climb down backward. If they slipped or fell, they were guilty. If they completed the climb smoothly, they were innocent. This is obviously a test of balance and coordination, not truthfulness. But the church argued that God would cause the liar to tremble and lose their footing. There's a record from Ely in 1198 where a woman accused of sorcery climbed the ladder, turned around, and fell from the 4th rung. She broke her leg. The court declared her guilty and burned her. Her leg was already broken. She couldn't run. That's not justice. That's adding injury to execution. Ireland had a uniquely Celtic version, the ordeal of the Holy Well. You would be taken to a well that was considered sacred, usually one dedicated to St. Bridget or St. Patrick. You would drink a cup of water from the well, then recite a prayer. If you began to cough, sneeze, or develop a rash within an hour, you were lying. The well water often contained high levels of sulfur or iron, which could irritate throats. But again, guilt was in the body's reaction, not the truth. Some wells were known to cause immediate sneezing. Those wells were called truth wells. People would travel miles to drink from them before a court case. The priest would interpret any bodily reaction as divine judgment. If you sneezed, you were guilty. If you burped, innocent. That's essentially random. But random was better than burning, I suppose. Now let's step back and ask a bigger question. How did ordinary people feel about these tests? We have some surviving letters and diaries from the period. A 13th century peasant named Salim bin D. Adam wrote about his fear of the cold water ordeal. He said, "I would rather confess to a crime I did not commit than be thrown into that freezing river with my hands tied." And many did exactly that. False confessions were common. In fact, some medieval legal codes explicitly warned against forcing people into ordeals because they would confess falsely just to avoid the pain. But the church's response was, if they confess falsely, they have sinned, and God will punish them later. So that was that. The innocent person who confessed to a lie was still considered a sinner. There was no winning. But here's something remarkable. There were also people who volunteered for ordeals to prove their innocence. In 1163, a man named William of Canterbury was accused of stealing a chalice from a church. He insisted he was innocent. The local bishop gave him a choice: pay a fine or undergo the hot iron. William chose the hot iron. He carried it 9 feet, his hand burned, but after 3 days the wound was clean, because he had secretly applied a poultice made of yarrow and honey. He was declared innocent. He then sued his accuser for defamation and won. That's right, he used the ordeal to extract damages. That's medieval litigation at its most cynical and brilliant. The psychological dimension of these tests is fascinating. Modern lie detection, polygraphs, voice stress analysis, even fMRI, is also imperfect. But medieval ordeals had an advantage: they were terrifying. Terror produces confessions. In a world without prisons or professional investigators, terror was the main tool for extracting truth. The ordeal was essentially a high-stakes gamble. If you were guilty and you believed in God, you would confess. If you were guilty and you did not believe in God, which was incredibly rare, you might risk it. But most people believed. So the system worked, not because the iron or water was accurate, but because the belief in its accuracy was widespread. That's why the decline of ordeals is so interesting. After the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, priests were forbidden to participate. But ordeals didn't vanish overnight. They went underground. In some places, lay people, not clergy, would conduct the tests. A village elder, not a priest, would heat the iron. A local judge, not a bishop, would interpret the blisters. The church had withdrawn its sanction, but the people hadn't lost their faith in the method. In fact, some peasants saw the church's ban as proof that ordeals were too powerful, that the church was afraid of God's direct judgment. So they continued anyway. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV officially authorized the use of torture, not ordeal, in canon law. That was the turning point. Torture was more reliable from the church's perspective, because you could control it. You could stop when you got a confession. Ordeal was uncontrollable. Sometimes the iron didn't burn, sometimes it did, and that unpredictability made the church nervous. So the rack and the thumbscrew replaced the hot iron and the cold water. But that's a different story. For our purposes, the key point is that ordeals persisted in folk practice for centuries longer than historians used to think. In remote valleys of the Alps, swimming, suspected criminals continued into the 1700s. In rural Russia, the ordeal of the cross, 2 people holding a cross until one drops it, was recorded as late as 1820. Let me tell you about a late survival in England, the ordeal of the stool. In the 16th century, during the witch hunts, a common test was to make the accused sit on a 3-legged stool in the middle of a church. If the stool tipped over, they were guilty. This wasn't official, it was folk justice. But there's a recorded case from 1593 in Essex where a woman named Agnes Sampson was forced onto a stool. The stool did not tip. The crowd became angry and tipped it themselves, then declared her guilty. She was hanged. So the test was just a formality. The outcome was predetermined. Now we have to talk about gender. Many of these tests were applied disproportionately to women. But because medieval society associated lying with female sinfulness, going back to Eve, women were subjected to cold water ordeals more often than men. The coarsened, the bread and cheese test, was often used for women accused of adultery. Trial by combat for women? They could hire a champion, but if no champion was available, the woman had to fight in person, unarmored, against a male accuser who was fully armed. That almost never ended well. The ordeal of the hot iron was gender-neutral in theory, but in practice, women's thinner skin burned more severely, so they were more likely to be declared guilty. The system was rigged against them from the start. But there's a strange twist. Some ordeals favored women. The ordeal of the Psalter, where a child walked around you with hot iron, was used more often for men than women. But because women were considered more nervous by nature, so their flinching would not be seen as guilt. Men were expected to be stoic. If a man flinched, he was guilty. So the same behavior, flinching, meant innocence for a woman and guilt for a man. That's not equality. That's just a different kind of bias. Let me share one of the most bizarre documented cases. It comes from a German town in 1312. A man named Klaus was accused of lying about the paternity of a child. He claimed the child was not his. The mother claimed it was. The local court ordered the ordeal of the finger. Klaus had to place his index finger into a candle flame for 10 seconds. If his finger did not blister, he was the father. If it blistered, he was not. This makes no sense. Why would truth about paternity affect skin resistance to fire? It wouldn't. But the judge believed that a liar's finger would sweat and thus burn faster. Klaus's finger blistered badly. He was declared not the father. The mother was fined for bearing false witness. Years later, a deathbed confession revealed that Klaus had, in fact, been the father. He had coated his finger with a thin layer of mud before the test. The mud dried and acted as insulation. So he cheated. And he got away with it. The moral of the story, medieval lie detection was not only cruel, it was easy to beat if you knew a few tricks. And that brings us to the final, most important insight. These weird tests were never really about finding the truth. They were about maintaining social order. If you accused your neighbor of theft and the ordeal declared him guilty, you were happy. If it declared him innocent, you grumbled but accepted it because God had spoken. The system absorbed conflict and produced a binary outcome, guilty or innocent, liar or truth teller. That outcome was accepted because it came from a divine source. No one appealed the decision. No one asked for a second opinion. Once the iron cooled or the water stilled, the case was closed. That's why these methods lasted so long. They worked as rituals of closure, not as investigations of fact. Imagine you're a medieval judge. You have two conflicting stories, no evidence, and a community demanding justice. What do? You can't spend weeks investigating, you don't have the resources. You can't torture everyone. That takes time and a skilled torturer. But you can order a hot iron. In one afternoon, the case is over. Someone is burned. Someone is vindicated. The crowd goes home. That's efficiency. That's why ordeals were so popular. They were fast, cheap, and everyone believed in them, or pretended to. We like to think we're more sophisticated today. We have DNA, surveillance, psychological profiling. But we also have plea bargains, false confessions coerced by exhaustion, and lie detectors that measure anxiety, not truth. The polygraph is just a mechanical version of the ordeal of the Psalter. It watches your body for signs of stress. And it's wrong about 30% of the time. That's not much better than a red-hot iron. The difference is that we don't burn people anymore. Most of the time. But we still want a quick, clean, absolute test for lying. That desire hasn't changed since the Middle Ages. We just dress it up in lab coats and computer screens. So what have we learned from this journey through medieval weirdness? First, that people will believe almost anything if you wrap it in prayer and ritual. Second, that pain is not a reliable witness. Third, that a system can be completely irrational and still function for centuries. And fourth, that if you ever find yourself accused of lying in a medieval village, your best bet is not to pray. It's to bribe the priest. Because the iron will burn you no matter how honest you are. The only question is how the wound is interpreted. And interpretation is always a human choice. There's a story from a 14th century French chronicle about a man who underwent the cold water ordeal 3 times. He floated each time. He was convicted of lying and hanged. After his death, the real culprit confessed. The village priest wrote in the margin of the court record, "God moves in mysterious ways." Perhaps the hanged man was also guilty of another sin unknown to us. That's the medieval mind. No failure of the ordeal could ever be admitted. The ordeal was perfect. It was the human understanding of it that was flawed. That's an unfalsifiable system. And unfalsifiable systems don't find truth. They just produce verdicts. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people were stupid for using hot iron to detect lies, remember this. They weren't stupid. They were desperate. They had no better option. And the really scary thought is, we're not that different. We still want a magic test. We still want a machine that beeps red for liar and green for truth. We still want certainty. The ordeals are gone, but the desire for them remains. That's the weirdest way medieval people tested for lying. Not the iron, not the water, not the bread. But the faith that a simple physical test could ever capture the human heart. That's the real delusion. And we still share it. We've traveled through the hot iron, the cold water, the blessed bread, the bloody duels, the bees, the bells, the ladders and the wells. But there are whole continents we haven't touched. Because medieval Europe wasn't the only place where people came up with bizarre ways to test if you were lying. The Islamic world, India, China, and even pre-Columbian Americas had their own versions, some eerily similar, some completely unique. And the more you look, the more you realize, the human obsession with a magical lie detector is universal. Let's start with the medieval Islamic world, roughly. 8th to 13th centuries. Islamic law, or Sharia, was generally more skeptical of ordeals than Christian Europe. The Quran emphasized witnesses and oaths. But that didn't stop local customs from creeping in. In Abbasid Baghdad, there was a test called the trial of the tongue. The accused would be given a piece of dry bread to chew for a full minute, then spit it out. If the bread came out moist enough to be reformed into a ball, they were telling the truth. If it was still dry and crumbly, they were lying. The theory? Fear of lying makes your mouth dry. This is actually based on a real physiological reaction. Anxiety reduces saliva production. So the trial of the tongue had a grain of scientific truth. It was essentially a medieval version of a dry mouth test, similar to modern psychological stress evaluators. But unlike a polygraph, it was free, required no machines, and could be done in a marketplace. Records from 10th century Cairo show that this test was used for petty theft and debt disputes. It was considered mild because the worst outcome was public shaming, not death. Still, imagine spitting out a mouthful of bread in front of a crowd and being called a liar because it was too dry. Humiliating. Persia under the Seljuks had the ordeal of the mirror. A large polished metal mirror, silver or bronze, would be placed on a table. The accused had to stare into it while swearing an oath. If the mirror clouded over, they were lying. This sounds like magic, but there's a physical explanation. Warm, moist breath from a nervous person can fog a cold mirror. If you were anxious, you breathed faster and shallower, and your breath contained more water vapor. The mirror would fog slightly. The judge would declare that the fog was a sign from Allah. Calm, truthful people breathed slowly and didn't fog the mirror. Again, this test had a basis in real physiology, though it was far from perfect. Some clever liars learned to hold their breath or breathe through their nose. Some innocent people with respiratory conditions fogged the mirror anyway and were executed. So it wasn't mercy. It was just a different kind of cruelty. Now let's go to medieval India. The Hindu legal texts, especially the Manusmriti and the Dharmashastras, described several ordeals, called divya. There were 5 main ones: the balance, the fire, the water, the poison, and the rice. The ordeal of the balance is fascinating. A large wooden beam scale would be set up, like a seesaw. The accused would stand on one pan. A stone of equal weight would be placed on the other pan. Then the accused would be taken off, and the judge would pray. Then the accused would be put back on the pan. If they weighed the same as before, they were innocent. If they were lighter or heavier, meaning their soul's moral weight had changed, they were guilty. This is pure symbolism. But weight doesn't change with truthfulness. However, the accused could cheat by clenching muscles or shifting posture. Some scholars believe the real purpose was to see if the accused would tremble or sweat during the process. The weighing was just theater. The priest would watch for signs of fear. So again, the actual lie detector was human observation, not the scale. The Indian ordeal of the rice was even stranger. The accused would be given a handful of dry rice and told to chew it, then spit it onto a sacred banyan leaf. If the rice came out bloody or with red streaks, they were guilty. The belief was that a liar's mouth would bleed because the gods would strike their tongue. In reality, chewing dry rice can cause microabrasions in the mouth, especially if you chew hard. So many innocent people bled. But some guilty people didn't bleed because they chewed gently. So the test was random. Still, it was used across medieval India for centuries. The Mimamsa school of Hindu philosophy actually criticized these ordeals as irrational, but popular belief overruled scholarship. China during the Tang and Song dynasties had a different approach. Chinese justice was more bureaucratic and less reliant on divine intervention. They used torture, yes, but also something called the trial by grain. The accused would be made to spit a mouthful of rice into a bowl of water. If the rice floated, they were lying. If it sank, they were telling the truth. The theory: a liar's mouth is dry, so the rice doesn't get fully coated with saliva, making it less dense and more likely to float. Truthful people produce more saliva, making the rice heavier and sink. This is actually grounded in real physics. Dry rice floats, wet rice sinks. So a guilty person who was nervous and dry-mouthed might produce floating rice. But an innocent person who was also nervous, say, because they were being accused of a crime they didn't commit, would also have a dry mouth. So the test punished the anxious innocent. There's a famous case from 1075 in Kaifeng where a scholar was accused of sedition. His rice floated. He was convicted and exiled. 10 years later, the real conspirator confessed. The scholar's family petitioned the emperor for posthumous rehabilitation. They got it. But the scholar was already dead. Japan during the Heian period had the ordeal of the hot spoon. A metal spoon was heated over a charcoal fire until it glowed. The accused had to lick the spoon 3 times. If their tongue blistered, they were guilty. If not, innocent. This is obviously impossible. Any tongue will blister. But the twist: the accused could ask for a cool spoon if they were of noble birth. So class determined outcome. Commoners got the hot spoon. Nobles got a spoon that had been heated only briefly, just warm enough to feel uncomfortable. This was less a lie detector and more a caste enforcement mechanism. Let's cross the Atlantic to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The Aztecs had a lie test involving a bowl of chili water. The accused would be forced to drink a large bowl of water mixed with ground chili peppers. If they vomited, they were guilty. If they kept it down, they were innocent. This is essentially a forced vomiting test. Chili water is extremely irritating to the stomach lining. Almost everyone would vomit, regardless of guilt. But the priest would interpret the vomiting as the truth forcing itself out. The test was used for minor offenses like lying about stolen maize. For serious crimes, the Aztecs used a different method. The accused had to walk across a bed of sharp obsidian blades. If their feet did not bleed, they were innocent. Obsidian is razor sharp. Everyone bleeds. So that test was a death sentence. It was used only for crimes that carried the death penalty anyway, treason, blasphemy, child sacrifice. So the ordeal was just a ritualized execution. The Inca had something gentler, the trial of the llama. A llama was brought into the courtroom. The accused had to stand in front of the llama and state their innocence. If the llama turned its head away, the accused was guilty. If the llama looked at them, innocent. Llamas are curious animals. They often stare at people. But they also turn away when bored or frightened. So the outcome was essentially random. However, the Inca believed that llamas were sacred and could sense moral impurity. Historians have records from 1530, just before the Spanish conquest, of a man named Atok who was accused of lying about a grain shortage. The llama looked at him. He was declared innocent. Later, a drought proved him wrong. There really was a shortage, but the llama had spoken, so no one blamed him. So the test worked as a mechanism of social harmony, not factual accuracy. Now let's return to Europe for some truly obscure ordeals that didn't fit into the first two parts. The ordeal of the plowshare? Yes, we mentioned plowshares, but let's go deeper. In 12th century England, a plowshare wasn't just a single hot iron. It was a row of 9 shares, heated red hot. The accused had to walk over them barefoot. But here's the twist. The shares were arranged with gaps wide enough that a careful person could step on the cold metal between them. The test was whether you knew the path. The priest would secretly show innocent people where to step. Guilty people were given no guidance. So again, it was a test of insider knowledge. This wasn't divine judgment. It was rigged from the start. The ordeal of the key we mentioned briefly. But there's a variant from 13th century France called the key of truth. A large iron key was heated, then placed on the accused palm. They had to hold it for the length of a Hail Mary. If the key left a mark, they were guilty. If the mark healed within a day, they were innocent. That's the same hot iron logic. But the key shape allowed for a cruel trick. The key's teeth would dig into the skin, causing deeper burns regardless of innocence. So the accused would always be marked. That's why this test was called the key of no escape. Now let's talk about animals in medieval European ordeals, not just bees and llamas. In 13th century Scotland, there was the dog's trial. A dog would be brought into the courtroom. The accused and the accuser would each be given a piece of meat. They would throw the meat to the dog. If the dog ate the accuser's meat first, the accuser was lying. If the dog ate the accused meat first, the accused was lying. Dogs are not truth detectors. They prefer the person who smells like meat. So the test was manipulated by whoever had handled the meat beforehand. But the Scots believed that dogs could smell sin. There's a record from 1296 of a woman accused of poisoning her husband. The dog ate her meat first. She was acquitted. Later, she admitted on her deathbed that she had poisoned her husband but had rubbed her hands with bacon fat before the trial. So she cheated the dog. The dog was not a divine instrument. It was just a hungry animal. In some German villages, a rooster was used. The rooster was placed in a circle drawn on the floor. The accused had to walk around the circle 3 times. If the rooster crowed, they were guilty. Roosters crow at random or in response to movement. So this test was effectively a coin flip. But people believed it. In 1348, during the Black Death, a Jewish man accused of well poisoning was forced to undergo the rooster ordeal. The rooster crowed. He was burned. Later, the real well poisoner, a Christian nobleman, confessed. The rooster had been wrong. But no one blamed the rooster. They blamed the nobleman for making the rooster crow through witchcraft. You can't win. Now we have to address the fakers. How did people cheat these ordeals? We've already mentioned a few tricks: herbal salves, egg white coatings, mud, controlled breathing, bribing the priest. But the most sophisticated cheaters were the professional ordeal specialists. These were people who, for a fee, would undergo an ordeal on your behalf, but they weren't champions in combat. They were people who had learned physical tricks. For hot iron, they would coat their hands with a mixture of aloe vera, egg white, and powdered charcoal. This formed a temporary heat-resistant layer. They would also press their hand against a cold stone immediately before the test, contracting blood vessels to reduce blood flow and blistering. For cold water, they would take a deep breath and expel as much air as possible before being tied, making them denser and more likely to sink. For the coarsened, they would secretly chew on a piece of ginger beforehand, which stimulated saliva and helped the bread go down smoothly. These specialists were often itinerant, moving from town to town, offering their services. Some were caught and executed for fraud. Most were not. Because who would suspect that a man who just walked on red-hot plowshares without burning was a cheat? You'd assume he was a saint. The church knew about cheating. There are several papal letters from the 12th century warning priests not to allow painted hands or false bandages. But enforcement was weak. In some monasteries, the monks themselves would cheat to protect wealthy donors. The ordeal was not a neutral test. It was a tool that could be bent. And that's the dirty secret of medieval lie detection. It was never about truth. It was about who had power, who had money, and who had friends. Let's move to the transition from ordeal to torture. After 1215, as we mentioned, the church withdrew its official sanction. But the need for lie detection didn't disappear. Instead, secular courts adopted torture. Torture was different from ordeal. In an ordeal, the outcome was supposedly God's doing. In torture, the outcome was produced by human pain. You were tortured until you confessed. But torture was also unreliable. People confessed to anything to make the pain stop. Medieval jurists knew this. They wrote long manuals on how to torture without extracting false confessions. For example, you were supposed to stop torture if the accused wept freely, because that was a sign of truth. If they cried but did not weep, they were lying. That's pure pseudoscience. But it was the best they had. Interestingly, some elements of ordeals survived inside torture. The strappado, hoisting the accused by their wrists, with weights tied to their feet, was sometimes called the ordeal of the rope. The water cure, forcing the accused to drink vast amounts of water until they vomited or confessed, was called the ordeal of the basin. So the names lived on even as the methods changed. The belief in a physical test for lying never died. It just got darker. Now, let's end with a few final, almost unbelievable cases that show how persistent these weird tests were. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, a form of the cold water ordeal was used. Accused witches were thrown into a pond. If they floated, they were guilty, same as medieval Europe. Several innocent people drowned before the test was even completed. That's 1692, the early modern period, not the Middle Ages. So the medieval mindset lasted far longer than we think. In 1751, a woman in rural Poland was accused of lying about a cow theft. The local lord ordered the ordeal of the bread and cheese, the coarsened. She ate it. She choked. She died. Later, an autopsy showed she had a congenital throat malformation. She had been innocent. But the court record says, God revealed her guilt through the bread. That's 1751. The Enlightenment was already in full swing. But in remote villages, the old ways persisted. The last recorded European ordeal was in 1836, yes, 1836, in a small village in Transylvania. A man accused of lying about a land boundary was forced to carry a hot iron. He did so. His hand festered. He was declared guilty and had to pay a fine. The case was reported to the Austrian imperial authorities, who were horrified. They sent soldiers to arrest the village judge. The judge defended himself by saying, We have always done it this way. That's the power of tradition. Even when you know a method doesn't work, you keep using it because change is harder than ritual. So what's the final verdict on weird medieval lie detection? It was cruel. It was irrational. It killed innocent people and let the guilty go free. But it also served a purpose. It gave communities a way to resolve disputes without endless feuds. It gave rulers a way to project power. It gave priests a way to reinforce faith. And it gave historians like us a bottomless well of strange, sad, fascinating stories. The next time someone says, "I swear on my life," remember that once upon a time, people meant it literally. They would pick up a red-hot iron. They would step into freezing water. They would bite into a piece of bread and wait for divine choking. They did these things not because they were stupid, but because they believed, truly, deeply believed, that God would not let an innocent person suffer. And that belief, however mistaken, is itself a kind of truth. It's the truth of human hope. The hope that somewhere, somehow, there is a perfect test. The test that never lies. A test that always knows. We haven't found it yet. We probably never will. But the search itself, from hot iron to fMRI, is the real story. And it's not over.